Dear ladies and gentlemen, it is both a great honor and joy to welcome our dear Professor Rostam Neuwirth within the context of our lecture series. He's the head for Department of Global Legal Studies at the Faculty of Law of the Macau University, and he's also program coordinator of master and postgraduate of law studies in international business law. He has achieved a doctorate of laws of the European University Institute in Florence, as well as a master in comparative and international law at McGill University in Montreal, and another master, the initial one, in the area of legal studies from the Karl Franzens Universität in Graz, and obviously also of the Université d'Auvergne at Clermont-Ferrand. His main teaching areas include transnational law, business law, especially in the BRICS countries, which has been mirrored also through a good wealth of his publications. He's further dealt with matters of intellectual property law, European Union trade law, and matters, of course, of artificial intelligence, which particularly will form the basis for today's lecture. In his very rich palmarès of publications, one has especially to point out not only his newest monograph regarding the EU's Artificial Intelligence Act, but also a very impressive monograph about the law in the time of oxymora. And I have to mention, especially for the Greek eye, dealing scientifically with the matter of oxymora is something which is very interesting, and for me personally has been very fruitful to especially follow respective videos of yours which you have published. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, with no further ado, I'd like to present Professor Neuwirth to you, and please enjoy.
Well, thank you very much, and and guten Morgen nach Europa, good morning to Europe, and a good evening from Macau. It's a great pleasure to be online and to meet you in this lecture series and to present today basically, well, a summary, a synopsis of my basically research and even the time as a student, I must say. But focusing mainly on my most recent book, which has just been published in August of this year, which is on the proposed European Artificial Intelligence Act. And it is only on one specific, actually, AI practice, one of the four planned AI practices that the European Commission would like to see prohibited, because they are basically posing unacceptable risks, and especially to fundamental rights and European values. But I will also take this opportunity to explain a bit how my interest in this field came about, because in fact this single practice that I will outline is one related to perception, to subliminal perception in particular. In fact, it is also very important because it basically falls in the domain of the link between law and neuroscience and the law and the mind and law and language, all of which I think is a bit, has become my main interest, because it is said very often that institutional reform, legal change happens only after cognitive changes have materialized. And that is, especially in the global setting, my main source of hope for changes, because at the moment I see that legal reform in those institutions that I've always addressed and researched, like the World Trade Organization, are more unlikely at the moment rather than likely. And therefore, I think we need to focus on the deeper layers that may trigger changes in this field. But to begin with, I want to mention that, in fact, the regulation of AI is of interest to me because artificial intelligence, as I will show, is considered an oxymoron, not by myself, actually by experts in the field, I would say, independently. It was repeatedly qualified as such. And there are also many regulatory paradoxes encountered in the field of technologies, new technologies, which is also like, I think can be applied to other fields, not only technologies, but any basically field that is novel in a way. And to briefly summarize, what are these problems, I would say, related to AI before I go back to some of the things I said before about the concept of AI being an oxymoron. I would say that many of these paradoxes and oxymora actually that are being used nowadays to describe these novel phenomena in a wide range of fields. They share, in my view, that they're very complex, of course, cross-cutting issues, which means they do not fall easily within a certain category. They defy classification, taxonomy, etc. They are also traditionally, in many ways, cross-boundary. So they cannot be like the cyberspace. It's not the territorial. It crosses borders. So like the global pandemic, I will mention. And also cross-cultural in a very broad sense, in the sense that they affect all the minds. And therefore also, no matter where you are, which language you speak, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, what characterizes paradoxes and oxymora is their contradictory element and content. They basically pose apparent contradictions. And here we have a problem that with these contradictions, for example, think of the term nutraceuticals, which combines nutrition and pharmaceutical. You have two different product categories that now become very often combined in functional food or something. And then we don't know, like in trade law, for example, we wouldn't know how to classify this tariff. Do we pay the one for medicines, the one for food, etc., or how to regulate them, how to allow them to be marketed, so on and so forth. And with them, also these concepts very often have a dynamic nature. For example, I've studied in great length the term culture industry, also qualified as an oxymoron, which was said by UNCTAD. It is an evolving concept. It's difficult to define. And this problem we also have with AI. And against this, all these qualities clash in a way with the current fragmentation of the international legal order, which the International Law Commission and many other commentators have established. It is traditionally based on a kind of division of labor, our international legal order, between specialized international organizations like for trade, for health, and so on and so forth. But with cross-cutting problems, this system is no longer, I think, capable of dealing with these phenomena in a coherent and consistent way. And then I've searched also in these 20 years, actually, since my PhD, for the reasons for this fragmentation of the international legal order. And I believe that this is a mirror of the human mind in a way. The way we think, we perceive, has been projected into our external like kind of world in terms of political institutions. And we have the same at the local level, at the regional level, and at the global level. We have also locally ministries for trade, for culture, for this and for that. And all this, I think, is, and we know that from the study of technology, the French philosopher Baudrillard said that technologies are extensions, are the extensions of the physical body. And now we are also starting to replicate the mind, the human mind, with AI. So I think law falls in this category, that it is a conceptual projection of our inner workings of the brain into reality. And then this is becoming an interesting, has an interesting dynamic where there's a mutual influence. And that's where I think we are encountering the limitations of our binary logic, and dualistic thinking, which is very traditionally applied, especially in legal thinking, but also in scientific thinking in the past, where, for example, in law, it is hard to conceive that you are right or wrong, or something is legal and illegal at the same time, or you're guilty and innocent at the same time. That there's such kind of fuzzy thinking completely defies what we understand to be the particular role of law, to find out what is right and as opposed to what is wrong. But here I think these technologies bring new challenges. And I think one thing that I will not have time today, but it is related to our perception of time too. I think the time concept is extremely important. Time is extremely important for every individual. It is for human beings, and it is for law. And it is also has been qualified as an oxymoron. There's a book called Time Management is an Oxymoron, because we cannot manage time, we can only manage ourselves, how we make use of time. So this briefly is explaining what I think is of very broad application, and not only to AI, but I will try to exemplify this with the discussion about the regulation of AI. And to come back to my book published in 2018, I'm happy that you also mentioned that these kind of rhetorical figures of speech, paradox, and oxymoron are on the rise. And I also checked it with Google's book Ngram Viewer. At least here statistically, it seems to confirm that what I felt was when I was a PhD student, I started with culture industry, and then I tried to expand my research areas. And wherever I looked, or health law or intellectual property, economics, business law, everywhere this notion popped up. And I thought, is this a coincidence? Am I paranoid? So I tried to verify that. And then I collected all these in my book. And the interesting thing is, when you look at the preface there, I wrote in 2017, at the time when I submitted the whole manuscript, I wrote the preface and I said, this world at the moment reminds me of something like a global disease, which threatens to undermine law. And that was before the global pandemic started. And the reason is that Gabriel Garcia Marquez inspired the title of my book, because he wrote the book Love in the Time of Cholera, which was kind of the time of love in the time of a disease, right? And then, so my underlying idea was to see whether oxymora are a disease that has befallen law. And I can sadly say that the pandemic in many ways also proved this kind of initial intuitive thought right. And it also brought, as we know, an increased interest and use of artificial intelligence systems. So this is the background, and the ultimate link between my most recent book and my older book and interest in oxymora was the fact that many experts, there's also recently I came across an article just published in AI and Society, calling AI an oxymoron. So this was why I started to look at these technologies in particular, because I realized that many new technologies were particularly framed as an oxymoron. And so I was interested in this and started researching this book. I also want to give some examples of paradoxes that characterize our time. Actually, one important one was James Rosenau. He, in 1995, already wrote in the first issue of Global Governance that the 21st century will be defined by profound, I think, contradictions, perplexing paradoxes, and many kind of tensions arising from that. And then also David Helt, I think 2010, he put it very well, I think, what characterizes our current situation in the world, in a global world, in the world of global law, that we have many more global problems, from climate change to conflicts, wars, the pandemic, yet we address them in very national, local, or weak and even incomplete ways, so in very fragmented ways. And that is a problem also. I think AI, in my view, falls also in the category of a global or a very local, to use another oxymoron, like field. And here, another important dilemma that was mentioned in the context of the regulation of technologies is that with new technologies, very often we hype them. Actually, this will come out in another related paradox, and we discuss them at the time when we can't predict the consequences, and by the time we have to deal with the consequences, it's too late to change what we have very often done. And this asks, in a way, or that raises the question of when is the best moment to regulate. Do we have to prepare first? Do we have to gain experiences, or do we have to wait and see? And we have nowadays, and the AI Act and so on also foresees the possibility of regulatory sandboxes and so on to experimentally. And that's why the time element is extremely important. And here you also see this time element in another paradoxical law applied to new technologies, which says that we usually overestimate the effect of a technology in the short run. Think of electric cars, in my view, everybody hype. And all of a sudden, it turns out maybe they're not yet that efficient, not that well developed, and so on. And then, but by the time we all have them, we underestimated their effect in the long run. And again, mixed with the other paradox, we are in trouble from a regulatory perspective. And then there's another paradox in a way that we call this age the Anthropocene, so which is a time where the human being is the dominant force on the planet. That's what the general definition is. Also, it is an age of an acceleration of change, which we also see, I think, reflected in various products. And strangely, if we are the dominant force, right, in view of the global problems, so we are in a way both causing these problems, but we are still unable to solve them. So we are in a control of the planet, but yet lacking complete control. And there's another paradox that said that, I didn't put that, I think it's by someone in the 50s, Gordon Allport, I think he said that there's a paradox in the sense that we have made too fast progress in matters of technology, of the physical, the natural sciences, but not in the understanding of human relations and human beings and especially I think neuroscience and cognitive workings of the brain, which are extremely important for the regulatory process. And ultimately, yes, we also have a paradox in a sense that we tend to think now that some of these technologies, AI, will be like a magical digital crystal ball, allowing us to predict the future. We have already predictive forms of these technologies, or Google acting as God, for example. And we see this also reflected in Harari's book. I think many people debated or read it. Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow, another oxymoron, of course, human being as a God and a history of the future. And this, in a way, clashes or is reflected also in this kind of paradox of, did we create a God, or God created humans? And here you see a paper that interprets Michelangelo's creation of Adam as a kind of subliminal, maybe, or hidden message about, like God and the brain being in a way kind of intertwined, or maybe he gave human beings cognition and also cognitive skills to create like God, if you want. That is up to everyone to solve for himself. There's also an example of a lawyer paradox. I don't know if you know that, where a law professor tells his student shortly before graduation, you only have to pay the tuition fee if you win your first case. And then the student actually sues him and says, if I win this case, he sues him for the tuition, right? So if he wins the case, he would be, in theory, entitled for the fee that he sued him for, but also wins the first case. And so the judges have a problem. It's a kind of dilemma, a situation, a loop that you cannot solve. But then the professor is also quite witty, and he responds that if you give judgment for the student, then he will owe me a fee because this is his first case. And that was the agreement based on which the judgment is going to be rendered. But on the other hand, also, he will owe me a fee because that is what is the content of the judgment, right? So, and the interesting thing about this paradox is how the judges, how the sources revealed the solution to this. And the solution was you see that here in the book, that the judges, considering this as dubious and inexplicable, they were thinking what to do. And then they said, well, we solved the problem by deferring the cause to a very distant day. So time as a solution to paradoxes. But we can also try to other ways. For example, analogy, like, and that is something that interests me the most here, in whether we can say that if one oxymoron is not contradictory, like culture industry was coined in the 1940s, basically by the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer. And at the time, they set it up deliberately as a contrast between culture and industry and mass production and so on and so forth. But over the time, in now creative economy, it has evolved, and everybody considers it very much as actually an engine of change and an engine of creativity and an engine of profits, the creative economy. So there's no contradiction anymore. But the law still very much is fragmented in that sense. For example, the WTO exempts cultural products to some, especially cinema, actually, in Article 4. So can we apply that? And Sunstein has this, shows that the analogy is very useful, but it doesn't work always. Like with a dog, can you trust every dog, or can you trust every car from the same assembly line? No, some perform better, some don't. So maybe some oxymora are not contradictory, maybe others are, or it depends again on the time. The same I want to show with is the case with our syllogism. That's how I was trained in law school, in a way that, you know, the famous example of like Aristotle is basically mortal because he's a human. But here, if we use that, for example, an oxymoron like cyborg, a machine-human kind of combination, a fusion of that. Again, this is an article that qualifies a cyborg as an oxymoron. And then we come to the conclusion logically with this kind of logical reasoning that Aristotle would be mortal and not mortal if he's machine and not machine at the same time, or machine and human at the same time. So these are the, I think, this is to exemplify the reasoning, the limitations of this binary reasoning in law. And this is another concrete case, culture industry, which, as I said, is interesting because it was set up as an oxymoron in the 1940s in the dialectic of enlightenment. But then it was actually in 1988 also introduced into international trade law by the United States-Canada Free Trade Agreement, which defined the term. And also now we have the UNESCO Convention on the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, which says, well, culture industry is both economic and cultural in nature. And so if we apply this kind of thinking, we come to the conclusion, if it is both economic and cultural, who is competent? Well, both the WTO and the UNESCO. But the problem is their respective agreements are in conflict with each other, because one says, well, you have to liberalize trade, and the other one says, basically, you can protect your cultural products. And that is a contradiction or an open conflict in many ways. And it's also a competence conflict, competence conflict, as Germans would call it. So this shows the difficulties with, I hope it shows that with regard to oxymoron and how they challenge our thinking. And then it becomes even more difficult, I think, now in the context of AI. And in particular, when it comes to these practices that are supposed to be prohibited, because they deal a lot with our cognition and with our mind. And here I started the book with this popular saying I read once, like, if you don't control your mind, the mind will control you. And we all know that the mind is sometimes, in a way, trying to take control. But the problem is, if we are not in control of the mind, it is also easier to control the mind for someone else. And that is, in the end, what AI can enable and intensify, in a way, this kind of control. And here I would just like to say that also generally these advances in the field of neuroscience and exemplified by these technologies open a lot of questions about the understanding, the interpretation of many human rights. For example, freedom of thought. And there's an excellent article that says freedom of thought in the age of neuroscience, because I thought always that freedom of thought was very much in the shadow of the remaining rights in this article, usually like freedom of religion, freedom of consciousness. But now I think it becomes even more important, because we have here possible tools to manipulate the mind and behavior, which really requires a broader freedom of cognition, in a way. Or do we have a free will still if we can be manipulated? So this is a very interesting debate that should be like initiated, actually. And the reasons why this should be done is because and luckily there is now really a dynamic after years of hype about the development of AI. Now there's a hype probably about the regulation of AI, but we have to be careful not to miss the train here. So the EU proposal from April 2021 is at the moment the most important one, I think the most advanced one, because it is the most comprehensive one. I think many countries like the US, China, and so on, they have adopted more sectorial approaches. But this is an attempt to comprehensively address this problem. It is also important that compared to others, there are more soft law approaches, like China has ethical norms. UNESCO has this recommendation on the ethics of AI from November 2021. This one is important for its symbolism, I think, because it reflects a huge global consensus. I mean, it's not the EU, it's 193 UNESCO members agreeing that there is a need to, there are ethical concerns related to AI. And I will show later that UNESCO says, especially for the impact on the mind. Also, the Council of Europe is preparing a convention, and the US, for example, has this year adopted an Algorithmic Accountability Act, but it is more focused and more narrow. So UNESCO is very important here. I think this recital in the preamble of that recommendation saying that, well, AI, it is having profound and dynamic impacts, but they can be positive and negative and not just one. And then it is, this impact is on societies, the environment, on everything, including the human mind. And that, I think, is very important. And then they add even, it uses, it can influence the human thinking, the interaction, decision-making, and with that also, of course, our actions and behavior. And that is a very, if that be true, it is a very powerful tool then, right? And for that purpose, Article 5 in this EUI Act that is proposed and now being negotiated, soon, I think the Council has a common position now, so it will soon be discussed together with Parliament, and then we'll see when it will materialize and be adopted, some say by the beginning of 2025, maybe. It plans to prohibit 4 categories of AI systems that basically pose unacceptable risks. And the first one is the one that is my book is dealing with, and I will mention mainly, but I want to mention the others too, because there's one problem already in this approach. By listing 4 categories, you may kind of face the problem I mentioned initially with the fragmentation of that regulation or regulatory approach, because the underlying technologies can be very much related, or their mutual combination only achieves the negative effect. So maybe in itself, like each single category is fine, there's no problem, but the combination of them, that what is called in German the gläserne Mensch, I think, so a kind of glass human being, completely transparent, becomes a reality maybe from the combination of this. And this is why I looked at this litera A in particular, because the language, I think, is in a way flawed. And just here, this is just this first category of prohibited systems. So I forgot to mention, maybe the first one is about subliminal techniques. The second one is one that exploits vulnerabilities. Here I will briefly say that I think we can say that everyone is potentially vulnerable, and we can also be made vulnerable. And that is a problem. That's why I think, for example, this one should easily be integrated with all the others. And the third one is about social scoring systems or social credit systems. And this is also something we could have a whole talk about, I think. And then the fourth one is about real-time remote biometric identification systems. But here too, we have elements in each one of them. We have elements that relate to subliminal techniques of kind of manipulative practices, because social credit systems, we have, for example, also positive forms of manipulation, in a sense that nudging is being discussed, that we find ways to push, give incentives or rewards even. Rewards are a way of scoring and rating behavior, right? So I will not go into this because of time, but I want to mention this Article 5, paragraph 1 and litera A, which says basically that the placing on the market, into service, or use of an AI system that deploys subliminal techniques beyond the person's consciousness are to be prohibited. And to be prohibited, they also have to fulfill the other requirements, namely that they must be intended to distort a person's behavior. And it has to be in a way, on top of it, that it is causing or likely to cause that person or another person physical or psychological harm. Now, as I said, I wrote a whole book about it, and we could discuss each, I think, concept here. For example, the harm requirement, the scope of harm, was being criticized by many commentators after they say it is too limited. What about emotional harms? So what about social harms and collective harms, for example? If we think about Cambridge Analytica or something, you know, manipulating a whole election has not only harm for one individual, it's for the society as a whole or something. And then we could also, of course, question how do you kind of distort behavior and so on. But already what interested me the most is what are AI systems that can use subliminal techniques, and then what is subliminal kind of perception and requiring the consciousness. And that, in a way, relates to the law. So the main regulatory challenges are, in my view, interdisciplinary, and that shows that that is also something we need to apply to any regulatory challenge posed by a paradox or an oxymoron. We cannot look at it from one field only. We need to do it through different and cross-check, because it's a cross-cutting problem. So only this one line shows us that we have a problem, many problems regarding the legal field, like what is AI? What is the relation to other norms of this act? You know, we have now so many, the GDPR, the Digital Services Act, the digital, and so on and so forth. There's a whole strategy coming, and how will they be coordinated with each other? Harm, I mentioned, also fundamental rights, like how do we interpret one? And can we say one is protected if all others are not protected according to the principle of the indivisibility of fundamental rights? And then, of course, we have the question of, is it my freedom to express myself subliminally or not? And so on and so forth. So there's a lot. And also enforcement, a very serious question in this context, which we know from the precedent I will briefly mention of the prohibition of subliminal advertising, because this has been already kind of prohibited in the European Union, in the Council of Europe member states since 1989, and in many other countries too. And then there are psychological aspects. So we need to know whether a technology acts at the subliminal level or above this subliminal perception. And subliminal means below the threshold of awareness. And then the question is, do we have such a threshold? Does everyone have it? Do we all have the same? And then for which threshold, where does the threshold be drawn for each sense? What we see, what we hear. And there are interesting experiments regarding subliminal perception also from other senses. How we smell, how we touch, for example. Very interesting experiment is for waiters and waitresses. They were asked to serve food and subliminally, basically touch the client. And then the study found that those waiters or waitresses who touched their clients when serving the food, even though they didn't notice it really, they received a higher tip. So a very interesting study that also other senses like touch and skin and so on are involved. And that also requires a whole lot of questions about how do we study the senses in law and also in other fields, right? And then the technical questions, which is also very difficult. And I have really tried as a complete layman. I hope that makes the book actually quite interesting, because I am not an expert in probably any of these fields, but my specialization is in the generalization and how to find linkages between them. So this is what I've tried to do. And to begin with, subliminal perception. Important is, I already said, it is defined as basically all those cognitive functions that are below our awareness, the threshold of awareness. Some say that, and I checked several sources now, basically here I quoted one book from 2012, Subliminal, saying that only 5% of our cognitive functions are conscious, are above that threshold, so are supraliminal, if you want. 95, and other study I found says 2% and 98% are actually below that threshold. I guess what is the scientific consensus from what I've seen is it's not static, it's dynamic. It changes depending on what you do. Sometimes you're more aware because you're concentrated. Sometimes you do things, or what you do. When you do it for the first time, for example, if you want to learn tennis, you're probably very conscious, and that's why you can't play it well. And only after a while, when you are doing it well, half of that, all the movements, I'm sure Roger Federer is no longer thinking how to throw the ball or something when he serves, right? So this is very important to know, because if that be true, and we find technological ways to also not just consciously interact with the mind, but like subconsciously, then you have a much bigger field for manipulation also, in positive ways and negative ways. So this is, I think, a very important starting point. And from a scientific perspective, it's also interesting that this subliminal perception was studied a long time ago. This is not at all a new phenomenon, actually. And one of the early studies were conducted in Vienna in 1917. An Austrian Purcell published an article on the relationship between such dream images and indirect vision. And he found in conducting these experiments, where he flashed images to people and then asked them to draw what they dreamt a few days later. And here you see one of those pictures. There are quite strong similarities between what they saw subliminally without their awareness and what they drew in dreams later. So even in dreams, we store maybe these kind of information. And the interesting thing is that apparently, I think he had to, unfortunately, emigrate like so many at the time from Austria, and then brought this knowledge, though rich knowledge, to the United States. And there it immediately met with the interest for its economic exploitation, in a sense that how can we use these psychological findings to marketing and advertisement. And there was this James Vicary, which I think is, this experiment is very well known, that in the cinema goers were flashed with advertising images so fast that they didn't notice what they saw, but they saw popcorn and Coca-Cola, and then apparently the sales went up. There's a long story about this because there were some controversies and so on. I will not go into that, but I would also like to mention another book that made a big, I think, fuss in the US in the 1950s also, Hidden Persuaders, where the author said that these subliminal techniques can not only be used to influence kind of consumer behavior, to buy popcorn and Coca-Cola, but also in a way for political purposes. So this was a very early example of maybe what the Cambridge Analytica scandal had proven later, that you can use various methods, subliminal or supraliminal, or to manipulate voters into a certain behavior. There's actually also another book I came across recently called What If, which is about the corporation in the US, which also claimed that it used kind of algorithmic, I think, models and simulations, and helped President Kennedy at the time to be elected as president. So these the awareness about these possibilities was already there, and the scientific backgrounds too. Here's an example of a subliminal advertising. I think I found nice because as a certain kind of sponsorship was prohibited due to, I don't know if you recognize the product already, but then I think some creative lawyers said, okay, when this kind of advertising is prohibited, we use this kind of barcodes, which when the car passes by, create a subliminal association with the underlying product. And nowadays, the interesting thing is that I have students already who don't recognize this kind of product, and I won't say what it is because it is harmful, but basically an example of subliminal advertising, or a way to subliminally maybe affect. And also people say this is also part of logos. They work a lot with this kind of subconscious effects, like Amazon A to Z, which gives us the association that while it offers everything from A to Z, Google, the colors, they say, is a combination that Microsoft also uses colors and shapes and so on. And all this has a kind of priming effect on our mind. And here on the right, there's a map of how many countries have basically outlawed or prohibited some form of subliminal advertisement on television. But nowadays, it is far more than that. It's not only about television, it is about various advertising techniques and practices, especially with social media, but also a combination with other technologies. So for example, like here, already some of these kind of practices that point at the importance of all the senses. This is what fascinates me, because Macau is an interesting place also due to its gaming industry. And I've noticed when you go into these casinos, they all have a specific fragrance in their air conditioning system. And smell, for example, has a very strong subliminal effect on our behavior. We say we choose even our partners subliminally through the nose more than maybe the other senses and so on. And there are studies that confirm that the more senses are engaged, the more memorable, the more interesting the experience of the consumer is, and the more likely he will come back. And now we are developing not only like the visual and the hearing, the audio-visual senses in electronic kind of formats. I think in the future, people will go to a restaurant and will take the mobile phone and will not take only a picture of the food they ordered, but also record the smell possibly. And then I can maybe send my friends the smell and even the taste, maybe through a device. You can like an electronic lip or something, you attach that, and then you can really taste what someone cooks on TV or what I've sent you on, or what I've posted on my social media account. But anyways, there are a lot of interesting studies going on, and what seems to be the case, I will try to show that too, that of course perception as such is not relying on one sense ever. We are always functioning in a multi-sensory way. But first, I would like to also say that there's a huge progress in the field of advertising and neuromarketing and so on. And Dirk Helbing, for example, he even went a step further and said, well, we are at the moment in the time where we move from programming computers to programming people. Maybe a bit exaggerated at the moment, but nevertheless, an interesting analogy with a lot of, for example, brain computer interfaces being, experimented with, and in the future providing some maybe more intrusive forms of manipulation. But also going back briefly to the history, there were other experiments that are reported, like, for example, playing background music against shoplifting in department stores, and apparently the shoplifting rates went down. Or a more serious kind of case was an allegation that was really, there were several allegations and lawsuits were filed in the US in the 1990s against rock bands for having hidden messages in their songs, which had apparently, allegedly, caused several teenagers to commit or attempt suicide. The lawsuits were not successful, but they raised a lot of awareness and discussions about these technologies, which were very much unknown, and still today it is very unknown. Even the prohibition of subliminal advertising, I find in discussions with people, is not well known. And this backward masking and so on and turning around works apparently because there's a study, I think, from Cambridge or something that shows that because the brain is pretty interesting, because it doesn't need always to follow the order. Even sounds or letters, we can understand them if at least the first letter or the last letter is in the right order, but the rest, it doesn't matter. We can read it, right? Which is quite interesting to see how the brain functions, maybe subliminally in that sense. So where do we draw the line? And then I tried to search this, and there I came across a field called psychophysics. And to cut the long story, and lots of articles I read short, I think the ultimate finding of all this, trying to establish where is the line between we see something, between we actually don't see something at all, or we still see it, but the brain is not aware of the fact that we see it. And that's very interesting. And ultimately, I think this article I found from 2012 sums it up, that this threshold is not absolute. So it changes. And it not only changes in a sense that you or I, we may have different thresholds, but even I, as an individual, have a different threshold depending on my kind of daily condition. If I feel well, or if I feel tired or something, or I had a beer, then probably my threshold might be lower. So this means, in a way, that the law, the way it has been framed, that there is subliminal techniques, is actually flawed, I think, because first of all, cognition is based on sub and supraliminal processes, and a lot of these technologies might also be dynamic. Sometimes they are functioning completely, everything is there, everything is clear, and sometimes they may flash or have a sound or a smell factor or something that maybe functions subliminally. And again, individually, it can be very different. So I think I still defended the choice of the language of subliminal, but for its symbolic and basically for the reason that it is a precedent from the prohibition of subliminal advertising. But I think when I spoke to psychologists, most of them confirmed that the language is pretty much also it's very strange to say it is subliminal, but then beyond the person's consciousness. So sub would be below, beyond means above. So it doesn't work really. And another problem is also that it didn't define or doesn't take into account any senses. And we have a criticism, there's interesting literature that the law, for example, is too ocular-centric, too much focused on vision. The term evidence in English, it comes from Latin to see, right? And we have several cases where we know that kind of like this dress here on the right, the golden white dress, that many people see black and blue. So for example, we have the same sensory stimuli, but we interpret them very different. And now imagine a court hearing witnesses saying, well, who stole the wedding cake? Well, it was someone with a white and gold dress, or it was someone with a blue and black dress. And the witnesses are all talking about the same person, right? And they're not lying. They're both saying the truth. And yet, again, our thinking would be, it cannot be that the same dress was seen as black and blue and white and gold. And the error rates in this field are very, very high. And that's why, to cut also this long story short, I'm very interested in the term of synesthesia for two reasons, because it is an actual condition reported with many people that, for example, you read a text, letters, and you see them in different colors, like here, or you listen to music and you see colors, and many people have reported this, artists and so on and so forth. But everybody, there's literature that says everybody can actually have it, can train it, and we might all have it, but we might forget it because we are never made aware of it. And I also find that the training in my whole time in school, I was always given there are 5 senses, and that is one, each one is one, and they have no interrelation. And I think by now we should know that the number is wrong, and they have very strong interactions with each other, and they influence each other. And there are very interesting examples. I can mention some of them if we have time. But now I want to move on to it. What are these systems that are like maybe functioning or potentially functioning as subliminal AI techniques? And here I would like to mention, first of all, that we are now like in an age where we are trying to replicate artificially the human mind. So this is the next step after Baudrillard saying technology is the extension of the body, like kind of a plane is artificial wings of our body, or the car is faster legs. We are now really trying to replicate the human brain, and with it, the human mind. And here, I just mentioned also, just want to show briefly the Article 3. It contains the definition of artificial intelligence systems, which has to be read with Annex 1. And there's a lot that has been said about it. Some said it's too narrow, some it's too broad. Like I said, the problem is oxymora are contradictory and evolving concepts and very dynamic. So I think I will not spend too much time on that, because I favor personally a broad definition, because of the rapid innovation in these fields. And also because the challenge in the future for these prohibited AI practices comes not from one technology alone, but from a combination of them. And for example, there's another term that is, I think, pretty much discussed now synonymously with subliminal forms of manipulation, which is dark patterns. For example, the OECD released just in October 2022, just a few months ago, a big report about dark commercial patterns, which are various practices you can observe yourself when you surf the internet, you do online shopping, e-commerce, that there are some very, very smart tricks how you create kind of how you maneuver the user into a certain behavior that you initially didn't even plan. Maybe you go online to buy an online ticket to a cinema, and in the end you come home and bought a car. I mean, you bought a car, you're still home on your sofa, but you already bought a car after that, because you were led from one movie which was sponsored by one car maker into believing this and buying that, and so on and so forth. So the OECD also explicitly mentions that these dark patterns include the possible like subliminal effects. And just to show you one of such, I think, dark patterns in a way. First, I have used many hotel booking sites, and I realized myself that they always exercise a certain stress. on me, namely by saying popular, last booked 12 hours ago or 2 hours ago or 15 minutes ago, right? Then there's in red like 61% off today, which already makes like, wow, this is a great deal. But we know that pricing nowadays, it's not like that a hotel room has a price for a whole year and after a year they raise it. It is fluctuating depending on demand, on season, on many factors. It's an ongoing process. So they maybe raise it in one day where they know nobody buys a ticket anyways. It's the first Monday in the new year. Nobody will go to a hotel room, right? So you raise the price to 5,000, and then the next day you say, okay, now it's only 500, and then you say it's a huge discount. But all this creates an incentive, right? And then another thing is what stressed me when I had to go to a conference is only 5 rooms left or only 1 room left. And then you're really panicking because you need to book maybe a hotel because you applied for this hotel. And now when we use these these simple dark patterns in a way, and then you can also hear, there was a study I found from 2020 where they used just the 360-degree videos of such a hotel room. And they showed it to certain test persons. And they showed the same video with this tiny emoji of a smiley embedded in the video, but subliminal. So the second set of test persons did not see the emoji, not with awareness. And when they were asked to rate the rooms, the 2 groups, those who didn't see that emoji and those who saw, those with the emoji, the subliminal emoji smiley, were much more eager to book this room. So if a tiny smiley that is subliminally perceived only through the sense of our eyes, without being noticed by our awareness, can lead to such an increase, I think it confirms that there is a potential. Here is another from the book of Mlodinov. There's another example, like an experiment that was made with, for example, for functional magnetic resonance imaging of the brain, and then connecting the data to the internet. Showing first an image that a subject saw, and then this is the image on the left of this book's page. And on the right, you see the reconstruction by the computer using fMRI plus access to data from the internet from several images. And they tried to guess from the electronic signals it detected what kind of visual information the subject was seeing. And it looks pretty much similar. And that was 2012. And that was only the connection of 2 factors, So I think with more sophisticated and more combinations, you can probably get more information. And here is another study I found from 2017, which says that they managed to do in the laboratory a kind of brain hack. They hacked into people's mind by using different combination also, I think, of these functional or computer brain interfaces. Plus, and this is in red here, I think they were showing certain subliminal information and used that also as an additional source for guessing, for example, someone's password or address and really personal data. So that's why I after that, I thought, sometimes on Facebook, for example, I see that there's a post, a sponsored post that says, there is no English word with double E. And then I say sleep. And obviously you think what, there are plenty of words in English with double E, right? But the point of this is probably not to guess whether you know that. It is to guess what is your first association when you see a word with double E. And when you do that over 10 years and you store all the data and you have all the other data that are stored from what you like, what you bought, what you did, what computer you have, I think it is very easy to reconstruct a whole virtual copy of yourself. And that's why they say after 200 likes, the computer knows you better than you know yourself. So I think I'm not an expert in these technologies at all, but I came across very interesting studies and experiments that seem to work in the lab or in reality already, that clearly blur the line between what is the virtual and what is the real world and what is maybe the brain and the machine in many ways. And also what I came across, what is very interesting, I have also discussed that with some colleagues here. We have a United Nations University in Macau for computer science, and I talked there, and I received some more information about attacks on these systems. For example, like what is called adversarial attacks through images, for example, with what is called noise here in between the two dogs. You see this kind of subliminal, to me it looks like a subliminal noise or whatever. You can mislead a kind of surveillance system or an AI learning machine learning system behind that into believing that this is not a dog but an ostrich. And there was another study, very interesting, that used glasses with some similar noise embedded on that, and then you see that the system recognized the person below, even though just because the person above wore these glasses. And I found another paper now in the meantime where you can do that also with makeup. So yeah, I think if you're sophisticated enough, you could probably paint some makeup on yourself, and I could be taken like deep fakes. Basically, I could be maybe, also the president of the United States in a recognition system. So very interesting, I think, examples. I hope for the sake of time, I try to conclude here with a few things. Basically, the first important thing is that perception is multisensory. It is not based on one sense only, and these senses cannot be isolated. I think this is a very principal finding that is important for law in particular, but also I think, obviously for those doing neuroscience and so on, and also for the economy, because the more the senses are engaged, the more the consumer is engaged and also can be lured probably into purchasing things. And this has to be, I think, in the future, especially also with deep fakes and all this, we have to learn how to rely and decipher information. I sometimes come across on YouTube, I search for a Formula One race and I watch who won last night. And then I realize after a while, my son told me once, now this is not a recording, this is a video game. The quality is so good that you can't distinguish what is real, what is virtual reality, or what is a video game. So I think, and you see that sometimes, for example, with deep fakes, the lip movement or the eye movement, and so you have, or the sound maybe, you have to look at combinations of this. And this is of very extreme importance for law in general, but for the regulation of AI and manipulative practice in particular. And then also, I think we should be understanding that human cognition is a very dynamic process. There is no absolute threshold of awareness. This is the same thing, like we have, for example, in traffic regulation, in a way, right? I mean, sometimes you're too tired to drive, maybe, and you shouldn't drive, even though you are allowed to drive, or you should. The same thing is very often that when the highway is empty or the highway is full, you're still allowed to drive the same speed, maybe legally speaking, but there are reasons not to do so. So we deal with problems here of a dynamic process, and how do we regulate dynamic processes with kind of static language, right? And I think maybe oxymoron, paradoxes help to induce some kind of dynamism also in language, because language is also a very, very dynamic kind of process, a reflection, like technology, I think, of the workings of the human mind. And the human mind is a very dynamic and very complex machine. I think subliminal primings, all kind of subliminal manipulation, even though this was a controversy in the past or so, but I think scientifically, from what I've seen, I'm convinced that it has an impact. What, of course, is clear that it is a different impact on different people at different times, and even the same person at different times. So, for example, I'm sure that, and that was also convincing, that if you're thirsty and you're shown kind of a soft drink advertisement subliminally, you will more likely fall for it. It's the same thing like when I try to buy a car, I will notice more car advertisements than when I don't want to buy a car, right? So there is these factors have to be taken into account, but I think we should stop saying it doesn't work, because there are still sources saying that. And I think the fact that advertising is a multi-billion-dollar industry also shows that some of this must work, otherwise you wouldn't spend so much money on it, right? Or even some of these, like, platforms become so rich based on advertisement because we spend so much time on it. And the addictive effects, I think we can all, especially after that pandemic, and for example, as a father of children, I can also see how addictive these machines are. I don't understand why my daughter is more hooked to a virtual piano on a tablet than the real piano in the living room, right? I mean, it's very fascinating to see that. So I think that is very clear. And another thing is AI is an oxymoron in a sense, and it is, first of all, not safe and not trustworthy. Because, and we know that from algorithms and so on, it replicates our own failures. We have created a system. We as human beings are flawed in many ways, not complete, not have full understanding of a lot of important things. So we can't expect that the machine that we created will be better than us all of a sudden. No, it is not. I think we have to be very clear in this respect, and we should have a very open debate about that. And paradoxes, again, ultimately here are also important because this relates to this whole debate about technology neutrality in a way. Is technology per se bad or per se good, or is it the use that depends? And it's again a dynamic process, and I think we need to be very like creative in a way of finding new ways of dealing with these challenges. But I think what is clear, it must be regulated, because it must be regulated by hard law, not just principles, ethical recommendations. There is some good literature that confirms that it helps, but it doesn't work, because we know that, I think, from consumer law, I've experienced that unless you're obliged to give a warranty, you will not give it. Very often I have experienced that 1 week beyond the warranty and they already said, sorry, too late. So I think we need a clear kind of regulation for that. And there are many reasons here. I won't go into these in detail, but basically it is not trustworthy. It is a global phenomenon. We also need a global dialogue on this. This cannot be done at the national level or a regional level alone. This will be another interesting question. Of course, the EU regulations very often have extraterritorial effect or an indirect effect on that. But we need a parallel discourse and debate, including all stakeholders here, because it is important to have a debate about the protection against these harmful ways of manipulation. Manipulation is something, like that should be used in a neutral term as well, because but I rather use then maybe nudging or something, and rewards. We work in both ways as human beings too. But we need to transcend this kind of either or thinking and dualistic thinking, because we need to ultimately search for greater coherence in this. And also like a new understanding has to probably crystallize, but like, for example, collective harms. I will stop here though, because time is up, I think. But I think, as I said in the beginning, cognition plays an extremely important role, not only in our lives, but also in the life of law, in the sense that cognitive changes, which are first, reflected also in linguistic changes. I found a very nice quote for my other book, which says the law changes because language changes. And I think language change, technology change, and legal change are all part of one process and emerging probably from cognitive change. And we need to protect this cognition also in some way from intrusions and from manipulations by others. Otherwise, Orwell, who is in many ways, I don't call that science fiction anymore or utopian. I think Orwell is a historian now. But if we try to be utopian and dystopian, maybe not private life comes to an end, but now private thought might come to an end if we don't act. So thank you very much, and vielen Dank for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Professor, and recht herzlichen Dank. It was, I'd rather say, very interesting presentation, a very interesting lecture. Personally, I do have a question already, but I rather would not be the first one to go. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions from your side to our dear Professor Neuwirth? And I found also quite intriguing the you know, the fact which you mentioned, that in order to prevent shoplifting, background music is played in some situations. So just imagine, for example, I do remember that Johann Strauss wrote his Banditengalopp, for example. If you would have the Banditengalopp as a background music, that could be animating also, maybe for some shoplifters. Anyway, so I do think
if I may just add, there is an interesting study I came across about the sale of wine. When a wine store put German wine and played German music, more people bought German, and when it's French music, more bought French wine. So should also be used, and it is used anyways in many contexts.
indeed, that's very interesting. So since I don't see any other participant asking, I'll start then. Of course, you were perfectly clear with your conclusion that AI must be regulated, and I perfectly agree with you, of course. And you underlined perfectly well that there can be some criticism already be worded regarding, for example, the definition part of Article 3 of the advised EU's Artificial Intelligence Act, and also the structure of Article 5, Para 1, as you mentioned. So my question would be, is it we've seen about the necessity then to regulate artificial intelligence. Is it possible at all to efficiently regulate that area, given our general experience, of course, that lawmakers usually tend to react to developments and are not very or not often capable to, act beforehand? What do you think?
No, thank you very much. Yeah, that's of course the crucial question. I mean, because we don't want to just adopt the law to have a law. That's maybe dead letter law or a stillborn law in a way. And there are two aspects to that. Of course, first of all, we need to make sure that the law makes sense, because the first, I think, role of the law is in a way, and that's what I expect from this initiative by the EU mainly. It starts a debate. It starts awareness. I'm afraid that, and that's the second point of it, the enforcement question will be huge. And I have contacted various regulatory, from the Council of Europe to the European Commission to the national regulators in Germany, in Italy, in France, in Austria, in the UK, of television regulators and for the prohibition of subliminal advertising. And to my surprise, some didn't reply. Most have no cases on this. And then I heard, for example, from the Austrian one that there was only once a complaint about some subliminal advertisement of dog food. I don't know how the person noticed it, but in any event, it was somehow addressed to dogs, and that's why they found they are not actually required to further investigate this case. But so it seems there are no cases because they only conduct random checks. And another paradox is, in a way, if subliminal techniques are not noticeable, how do you notice them and detect them, right? And the interesting thing is, like from a lot of these debates about deepfakes, fake news, is that one way of detecting them is the same technology that creates them in the first place, right? So it's a bit like a vaccine, I think, is part of the virus, right? Or the snake, the antidote against the snake bite is from the snake poison. So we have to, I think, and that's part of paradoxical thinking for me, that we not only look at the law at one point in time, namely at the time when we adopt it. No, we have to see it as a process. We have to think the process from the beginning to the enforcement as well. Already think about who is going to be the regulator that enforces it. How do we do that? What are the technologies? And then also, like, of course, we have to have a parallel debate. And another, now, of course, what you mentioned is very important, that we do not start the regulatory process when the technology is in place. That was this Collingridge dilemma also, because then it's too late. You can't change it anymore. You can only add some patchwork here and there. So that's why I think there's this term of regulation by design. You try to, you know, like probably we have to bring together developers and regulators and from the very beginning and keep them in a loop together. I even thought that, you know, like at the universities, because I've noticed also in my research that even in the same university and let alone between different universities, the exchange of information about these things that we all now work on is too thin, too limited, and we don't have the common language even. And so, for example, we should, in a way, already when all these papers that I read about by experts in the technology field, the lawyers should attend those conferences too and ask them, what does it mean concretely? Because I had really problems, of course, without background information to even understand these papers. But luckily, there are some of them, the abstract is always understandable, it seems. So yes, absolutely. And I think, again, oxymoron, like, you know, help us to expand our like mind in that sense, to be more open. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Dear ladies and gentlemen, any further questions to our dear Professor Neuwirth? Seems not to be the case. Then I'd like, dear Professor, to warmly thank you for this very, very interesting lecture. And I think that all our participants have gained a lot here and have seen that above all, I'd rather underline what you also said about synesthesia. That is very important to understand that the senses do not actually act on a parallel basis, but indeed one has to be open-minded in any ways regarding these topics. So I'm pretty sure that we gained a lot here.
If I may add one last thing, I'm not surprised in a sense. I mean, about probably this is a lot to take in at once, because I must say that you, as with a Greek, you know, like background, you understand the oxymoron, and I must really thank all my students here in the past, because I've been teaching this in many ways, and in the beginning of the semester, I teach a course on global justice, for example, which I frame as an oxymoron, together with creative economy. And they see global justice, creative economy, and they think, oh, interesting course, right? And then they first class, and I talk about an oxymoron, and people are like, most of them are thinking like, oh my God, what is this? And the interesting thing was that usually it takes me like a good 2 months to show the connections and to make it really like to be able to grasp the connections between these terms. And they create a bigger picture. And it was actually, I must say, when I was working on the book and when the book was finished, I was looking for a publisher. And the publishers were very, very reluctant. And I almost lost hope in a sense, because they kept sending it. They all said it's interesting, but not my field. So they kept sending it to the same department, you know, legal law, European law, global law, transnational law, philosophy of law, legal theory, legal history, everything, law and language, until it came back to the same department. And it was here, I must say, that the feedback from students who even like years later, I received sometimes a postcard or an email saying, I found one here in my job, a new one, a new oxymoron that really changed my kind of perception of things. So if anyone has any questions later, maybe, or in a year from now, I think my email address is at the university is freely available in the net. I'm happy if I receive always feedback on these or new examples or new areas that I haven't covered. I will anyways look out for them also. So if anyone publishes it, I will probably cite it in the future, in future books and articles. But thank you very much for the invitation, and I enjoyed it very much, and wish you a good evening, good day, wherever you are.